Hi everyone, welcome to the Empower Sounds podcast. My name is Mahika, and this podcast is all about celebrating the stories of women from all walks of life and delving into the mindset behind their successes. Today, we're joined by Jill Pei. Jill is a remarkable woman who has made significant contributions in various fields. She holds an impressive list of achievements, including being the first ever female to be appointed as Serjeant at Arms in the House of Commons in 600 years. She developed a security strategy to ensure the personal safety of over 3,500 people who work in Parliament in both houses and 1 million visitors annually. She is also the chair of the Savvitas Senate and the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Coram Beanstalk Children's Literacy Charity. Alongside these several impressive accomplishments, Jill chairs the Gender Index, an innovative initiative that aims to promote gender equality by publishing gender data across the UK. On today's episode, we will be discussing Jill's kaleidoscope career with her and be delving into how she managed to get to such amazing positions, overcoming the sense of imposter syndrome and the barriers in her career. Amazing. Well, today we have the privilege of being joined by Jill Pei, a remarkable woman who has made significant contributions in various fields. Before we talk to you about your career, let's talk to you about yourself. Throughout your career, you've had many roles. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I wanted to be a doctor. That was my passion. And I took all the right subjects at school and really got through at the end of school. And it really became clear to me that although I'm very tenacious, I should say, I never give up on anything, but I realized that I was going to want to get married and have a family. And I didn't think I could do justice to both, and that to take up an opportunity to study medicine and then not stick with it, which would have been really against my nature, that was not a good thing to do, to take up that place. I should leave that place for somebody who was going to dedicate their life to it. So I had a change of direction and went into business management.
And how was that experience when growing up for so many years, you had the ambition? What was it like to suddenly change course? Did you enjoy it? Did it take time to adjust?
It was it was quite a defining moment, really. You know, I was a teenager, late teenager, I guess, and it really made me realize that I had the power to make that change. So it was down to me, and I thought about it for a long time, but once I made the decision, it was exciting. It was a new direction. It was a new venture, but it was the realization that that was my gift to give myself to do that.
That's really inspiring. It shows through all of your work that you've done in your career and the fact that you wanted to be a medic earlier in your life, that you really care about social issues and you care about helping people and the world. What would you say is the social cause you care the most about? Like, what is the one that hits closest to home?
That's probably supporting children. That's probably supporting the children there they struggle to learn to read in primary school. And for various reasons, it's not a poverty issue. It's not a disability issue. It's a disadvantage issue. So these children, through no fault of their own, and maybe sometimes not the fault of their families, but they don't have the advantages and the opportunities. And if you can't read, you can't learn. It's as basic as that. Literacy is so important. And so I would say, yeah, if I had to choose one passion, it would be supporting the children.
That's really empowering. And I think that leads perfectly into us talking about your work as the trustee of the Coram Group of Charities, where you've been involved with the Beanstalk Children's Literacy Charity, where you have been instrumental in promoting literacy amongst children. How has this impacted the lives of young readers? And can you talk to me a little bit more about your motivations to support this cause?
Yes. I mean, this sort of underpins everything we're going to talk about. So I'd had this amazing, what I describe as a kaleidoscope career, ending up as being the Sergeant at Arms in the House of Commons. And I wanted to move to something different while I still had all the energy and enthusiasm and good health to do that. So I had to think very hard about what was going to motivate me. And although I'd had some amazing experiences in Parliament, they were all very much one-off or projects. Yeah, project comes to an end, something new. But the things that really stuck with me was seeing the people around me develop, and to have had a hand in that, I hope, seeing a lot of them develop and grow. And I do have a love of reading, and so do my children and grandchildren. And it dawned on me through actually a campaign in the Evening Standard in the summer of 2011 that the SATs results across London had been incredibly poor. And the Evening Standard had managed to persuade a Russian oligarch to give them a big blob of money to try and do something about this, to raise literacy levels across London. And part of doing that was to recruit and train some volunteers to work in a school in Battersea, where I live, to support the children who were struggling. And that really, that hit it home. A light bulb went on, and I thought, well, I can do that. That's something I can do now easily. And I'm not a very patient person, so I wasn't prepared to wait a year to be able to do this. But I thought I can do this around the rest of my life. So I applied and was appointed as a volunteer reading helper and was trained. And I started, I think, in about October 2011. So when I left, or was giving up my role in the House of Commons, I handed over gradually over about 4 months. So it wasn't just a complete stop. And so I was able to fit in the training and then starting to read with the children at that time in the autumn of 2011, although I didn't actually retire until into 2012. And it's just such a rewarding thing to do. And I think it works both ways. It's really good to do some volunteering and giving back. And you enter this little world with the children, so you leave everything else behind. So for mental health, it's really good to volunteer and do something like this. And a lot of it is about getting to know the children and getting them comfortable with you, finding out what they're interested in, because that's very often the key, is that they just see reading as the school's scheme about, very basic stories, not even stories, just descriptions. But if you can find out something that really sparkles them up. With one little boy, it was football. And I got someone to give me a Chelsea football program and took that into school. And he couldn't read it all, but he was absolutely engrossed in it because it was about something that was a passion for him. And I think really what we try and do is to get children to love reading and then really enjoy it. And then it's a pleasure for life. But of course, the other side of that is literacy. Once you're literate, then you can learn absolutely anything. And we see that their confidence grows. So once they're they can realize that they are a reader, then they'll volunteer in class, they'll answer questions, they'll want to be in the school play, they'll want to do the sport things. So it's holistic self-belief for them.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important. And I grew up with learning disabilities, and I remember a light bulb moment in my life when I learned how to learn for the first time, because I realized that not everyone learns in the same way. Yeah. And I found that really empowering. And now I love reading and I love volunteering as well and helping other people in that path. So I think that's amazing that you shared that. Thank you. I also wanted to ask if you have had any books in your life that have personally influenced your philosophy, your interests, and your career.
I think, Little Women was one of them, by Louisa May Alcott, with a family of the 4 sisters who were all very different from each other, but shared the same values. And I think that's quite an important thing to understand, that you may not have a lot in common with people, but if you share the same values and you have the same ambition, then you can really work together. And I think that was a book that meant a lot to me. And Black Beauty as well. That was I didn't have a lot of animals around me growing up, but the girl's love of the horse and the horse's love of the girl, it really made me understand that animals have these emotions too, and there can be a great bond between an individual, a person and an animal. So those were 2 that really influenced me.
That's really nice. And I really like the idea that you talk about values and shared values and the difference between preferences and personalities and principles. What would you say are your core and guiding values that have carried you throughout your many years of life and your career?
One is to be your authentic self. I think that's incredibly important. You see a lot of people stumble when they're trying to be something they're not. or sort of a lot of people suffer because they go for a job that they're not really suited to, and then they begin to fail, and then they have mental health problems. So a big one is be your authentic self. Believe in yourself. Self-belief is the greatest gift that you can give to a child. And I think I've demonstrated that through the Beanstalk work, but also that with my children. I think that if you have self-belief, you can do anything you want to do. So that's another important one. Yeah, thinking about other people, not thinking about yourself first, thinking about other people first, even in a business situation, to be able to think about the other side or the other person's point of view gives you a really good perspective of what the issue is that you may be trying to achieve or trying to solve. But I think getting the other person's point of view as well, that's 3, isn't it? And what's 4? Oh, 4 is, yeah, having fun. However hard you work, there's got to be some fun in there.
I love that. I feel like that one's not really discussed as much.
No, it isn't. But I think if you're not enjoying things, then you're not going to stick with them.
100%. Speaking of, I think this lends perfectly into us speaking about your career, which has been a series of what I imagine to be several very fun roles. You started your career in advertising, and you worked your way up from a PA to an executive role in your firm. What was your experience working up the corporate ladder, and what advice would you give to young women looking to work their way up in the private sector, corporate ladder, that kind of field?
I think I was fortunate in that advertising was a very equal environment. So I worked on the creative department, and there were as many women as men because they had the talent. So I think that was a very good environment to start in. Yeah, I think, taking every opportunity, you've just got to evaluate every opportunity that comes your way. Don't think, oh, I couldn't do that. Well, maybe you could. So have a look at it, because those opportunities never come again. So really look at them hard and decide if you want to take it or not and go down that avenue. Build a network. Really, that's really important, particularly when you get nearer the top, because those top positions are very lonely. So whether you're running your own business, you're head of a department, you're sergeant at arms, you're CEO of NatWest Bank, those positions are lonely. So you do need your network outside your own business environment. It's really important. You need it within it, but you also need a good network outside. And something that I really am really passionate about is mentoring. And you will have experienced that with 2 chicks. But I think mentoring is so important. I mean, I didn't have mentors in my early career, and I wish I had. And maybe I had some people who were sort of taking on that role, and I didn't recognize what it was. But I think everybody should have a mentor, whatever they're doing, to have that safe environment with somebody where you can share ideas, share ambitions, let off steam if you're angry about something, safely run your ideas by, and they will tell you whether they think they're any good or not. But just having that safe environment in a good relationship with somebody is so important. And it doesn't matter what sex it is or what age. There's a lot of what's called reverse mentoring now, where younger people mentor older people. Some of my best mentors have been men. They bring a different perspective to things, and that's important. I talked earlier about perspective, but I think, somebody you respect, of course, there must be respect both ways in the relationship, but listening to somebody else's perspective on their take on something will be different from yours inevitably, but it will make you think a bit differently as well, and that's really good.
Thank you. I think that's really insightful. I've spoken to some of the other guests about mentoring, but I feel like the idea of looking for a mentor that doesn't kind of reflect your story is really interesting, because it shows you a unique perspective, and I feel like that can be really valuable.
I think it's important to have a mentor outside your work environment. I know a lot of companies do have mentoring schemes, and it's better than not having a mentoring scheme. But I think the most effective mentoring relationships are when they're outside your sphere of business. So you really do get a different dimension from your mentor, and also for you to look at, for you to see as a mentee.
100%. So you speak very nicely about how creative and fun working with advertising was. What made you decide to switch from your work in the private sector to working in the House of Commons?
It was probably about my life stage, actually. I moved into the public sector before the House of Commons. So there was one job before the House of Commons, which was in education. And that was, interestingly, it was at an enterprise technology centre, and a long time ago. So I was really sort of in that mindset at that stage as well. I think it was about lifestyle, life stage. My children were getting to the stage where they needed me around more. They were both at school, in the sort of late primary school, and my parents are quite sick and I'm an only child. So I'm, to be working in London and to need to get back for either the children or my parents was getting a bit tough. So I looked for something nearer home, basically. That's and this was a very interesting looking job. I wasn't looking to go in the public sector, but it was a funded project for a limited number of years. And it was all about using the latest technology, and it was about enterprise. I think I have an enterprise mindset anyway, but I wanted to learn about the latest technology because I did want to set up my own business. So I thought, well, if I go here for a few years, I can learn all of that, and that would be good. But I got very hooked in it, so I stayed longer. And it was all about making school and college curriculum more work-related and producing the students that business wanted rather than what teachers thought they wanted. And we had huge success. And I actually think now enterprise should be in the curriculum all the way through, from primary through to higher education. But so that was my sort of step into the public sector. And the funding of that job came to an end. We all knew it was going to. So we needed to look for other things. And I saw a few jobs that I quite liked the look of. And my children were older at this stage, and sadly my parents had passed away. So I didn't have the same sort of constraints. So, the world was my lobster, as they say. And I just I knew the job was out there. I knew the job was out there that was going to bring together all the things that I thought I was good at and that I liked doing. And I applied for a couple of jobs and got offered them. And I thought, no, this isn't it. And my friends thought I was being very picky, but I stuck with this belief that there was a job out there that was for me. Anyway, one day my husband brought the Daily Telegraph home and he said, oh, there's a job here that's, looks like you. And I read House of Commons head office keeper. And I said, you must be joking. I know nothing about politics. I didn't even know what a head office keeper is. And he said, well, just read on. So I did. And of course, he was right. They were looking for somebody who'd got my skill set. And it was the things I liked doing. It was about people management. It was about developing. It was about change management. And so I applied. And through lots of rounds of interview and presentations, I think about 300 people applied. I got to the last shortlist, which was the first time I'd actually been into the House of Commons. The other things had taken place in buildings around Westminster. And I went into the House of Commons. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. And I don't know if you've been there, but Central Lobby is a huge, very high domed ceiling area with statues of former prime ministers. And it's all very grand. And I was sitting there on my own on a green leather bench. And I thought, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? So the old syndromes came into play. And then after a few minutes, I thought, well, these people who have invited me to the final interview, they believe I can do this job. Who am I to undermine them? I should believe I can do this job. So the imposter syndrome began to drift away. And I went into the interview with that mindset that if they believe I can do this, I believe I can do this, and was offered the job. And it was actually head office keeper as a facilities manager. So it was about all the frontline services in the big Parliament building itself, but also the other buildings around Westminster. So I had about 120 staff to deliver all these frontline services. But actually, it was change management because it was very hierarchical, very military, very introspective. And they just needed someone to come and shake it all up and make it different. And I think when I started, I was fortunate. I had a 2-week induction before I actually started the job. And the first question that the staff asked me was, what should we call you? And I said, well, Jill, that's my name. And I then discovered that all the men had been called by their surname, and all the women were called Miss Brown or Miss Smith, whether they were single, married, or whatever. So that was a very fortunate first question, because I realised then, what change I was up against and what I had to do. But yes, it was great. And I was able to spot the people who'd got potential and develop them on. So there was a good pipeline of management and opportunities, and turn this culture around, and to stop them being introspective and understand what customer service was about. And of course, job satisfaction rose as well, because they had happy customers, not people who shouted at them all the time. So yeah, that was 5 years of very interesting time. In my career in the House of Commons after that, I was given the project to open Portcullis House, which was the new parliamentary building. And I was in there with hard hat and boots and up scaffolding, showing the members around. And that was about 20-month project, I think. And it was to get the building ready and then organise all the moves in. And we bespoke 211 offices for members and their staff. And the last part of that was to help to organise the official opening by the Queen. So that was pretty special.
Wow, I'm speechless. There's so much to unpack here. First of all, thank you for being so candid about imposter syndrome. I think sometimes people try to give the impression that they're invincible and that it's all uphill, but thank you for sharing your doubt, because I feel like that's something that a lot of the listeners will resonate with.
Yeah.
Did you feel like the imposter syndrome went away once you got the job, or did it come back once? Because you said that when you went into the interview room, it left because you believed that they had faith in you, so you should have faith in yourself. Did that mentality carry itself into the job, or did you have to kind of remind yourself of that?
Oh, I had to remind myself. There were times when I got back to what am I doing here? Can I do this? But I did have this inner belief that I could do it. Yes, I do have great self-belief, but you do get times when it jumps back in, but I can easily flick it out now. It's a waste of time. Imposter syndrome is a waste of time. And when I'm talking, to groups about this, or we're in a team meeting or something, I will say to them, okay, I want you to write down how many people in this room you think are imposters. And most people just have one, and that's themselves.
Wow.
That is a powerful thing to do, because I don't think we think of other people that we're working with as imposters. We may spot areas that they can develop, but not that they're imposters. I'm very dismissive of imposter syndrome, but I've happily worked one-to-one with people to get over it and recognise what strengths they do have.
And how do you think that your experiences in the private sector helped you be more flexible when working in the House of Commons and your new role? And like, what skills do you feel like the unique skills they brought?
Well, customer service was absolutely one of them. That went right back to working in advertising, because that is all about the customer. So that stood me in good stead for a long time. Being very organised, be able to react quickly to things, which isn't so much the style in Parliament, in public sector. Apart from that unique project that I worked in on enterprise, that was very reactive, and you had to really think on your feet and react quickly. And to be able to think ahead, I think that's to be able to, to be able to look at the detail of something and the bigger picture is quite a skill. And I know I can do that. Some people sort of get embedded in the micro, and other people are really good at the macro, but you have to try and draw those two together. So that's something I picked up. Really good planning. I mean, you've got to be able to think ahead. You've got to be able to plan ahead and see what your ultimate goal is. But then you've got to get other people to tie into that vision. And that's something important. When I did the Portcullis House project, I had a hand-picked team of all the experts that I needed. So designers, furniture people, telephone people, computer people, and I got them all to agree to this vision. And our brief was the smooth occupation of Portcullis House. That was it, the smooth occupation of Portcullis House. So that was the brief I had. And I got them all to articulate what that meant to them in their different spheres of specialism. I mean, this took a while, believe me, this took a little while to get this sorted. But then it was about how knitting that together. So if this has got to be right for this one, what's that one got to do to be able to make that right, and sort of down the chain. So to be able to get a dozen people into that was quite something, but never losing sight of the vision. You know, if they got sidetracked and they say, well, yes, but the smooth occupation of portcullis house, what does that mean to you? And keeping people very focused is something that's really, really important. Always taking them back to what you're really focused on.
That's really interesting, and I feel like that's very tangible advice for people looking to go into leadership and management, regardless of the sector or industry that they work in. Moving on, how did your experience working up the ladder in the private sector vary to working in the public sector in the House of Commons, and ultimately making history as Sergeant at Arms of the House of Commons?
I think the speed of things happening is the biggest difference. Decision making, you know, there's a lot of bureaucracy in the public sector, and I really wrestled with getting used to that. And the ultimate of that was I applied for the Sergeant at Arms job in September and was appointed on the 30th of January. In the private sector, somebody would ask you to go and see them on a Thursday and say, we'd like to offer you this. You start on Monday. You know, that's the difference. But decision making, budget planning, opening up resources, all of that is so much quicker in the private sector than it is in the public sector. But then that makes you plan better. That makes you very flexible and agile in the private sector. In the public sector, it does make you plan better, that you get the stages of things in there.
And that's really interesting. It's really cool that you have experience in both sides.
Mm.
Now, moving on to, again, you making history. In 2008, you became the first woman to hold the position of Sergeant at Arms in the House of Commons in 600 years. For people who don't understand what that means, can you please explain the significance of this role, and how you got into a role that is typically reserved for people from a military background and men?
Well, if I take you back a very long time, the first Sergeant at Arms was appointed in 1415, actually. And it was the time of the Plantagenet kings. And Henry V had a number of sergeants at arms, and they were his strong arm men. So they would go and recruit the sailors to fight his naval battles. They would press gang people to be soldiers to fight the Battle of Agincourt. And at that time, the House of Commons was very unruly. And he sent one of his sergeants, Nicholas Mordaunt, down to help the Speaker to keep order. And Nicholas Mordaunt must have done quite a good job, because there has been a sergeant at arms there ever since. And that was a very military role at that time. And although the role has changed and become more managerial and in charge of security, it was very traditional that it was an ex-military person who got the job. And I think for many hundreds of years, they were just appointed, they were just fingered to do the job. But it did sort of in the probably 20th century and thereafter, there were elements of competition, so people who applied, but the people who applied were mostly ex-military. Now, in the Commonwealth, in every legislature, there is a Sergeant at Arms. So all the legislators are based on the Parliament of Westminster. So whether it's Ottawa or Canberra or a tiny island in the Caribbean, they will all have a Sergeant at Arms. So when the post in London becomes available, it's a very glittering opportunity for all these people. So you've got all sorts of military people applying. Then you've got a lot of people who were either a sergeant or a deputy from the Commonwealth would apply. And I don't know how many women applied. I haven't been exposed to that. But I was highly encouraged by members of Parliament to apply, by my peers, because a lot of members knew me by then, particularly through the Portcullis House project. But I worked with the then sergeant between that, and I was the first woman to be an assistant sergeant and so on. And so that I was very much encouraged to apply. And as I said, I applied in September. Oh, and there were written papers and presentations and psychometric testing, boards and headhunters until it came to the beginning of January, and it was down to the last two. And I understand that it was an ex-brigadier and me. So they had to decide, did they want more of what they'd had for 600 years, or did they want somebody with a very different approach? And so that the military approach is this is generalizing, but it's very much no or yes. And if it was no, well, then the members in their staff would try to find a way to get what they wanted around the system. Whereas my approach is much more facilitating. So it's about finding out what it was that the member wanted to achieve and how we could work together to achieve that without offending the speaker, breaking the rules, or from my point of view, compromising security, because 80% of my job was about security. And so, and so we were both interviewed by the speaker, which was Michael Martin at the time. And then he made a recommendation to the Queen because it's a royal appointment. And she accepted the recommendation that it should be me. So it was announced at 12 noon on the 30th of January, 2008, by press release from Buckingham Palace. And then at 12:05, everybody expected me to be the world expert on everything to do with sergeantry, which of course I wasn't, but I knew the people who were. So I had all the experts available to me on all the security issues, counterterrorism issues, everything that I if I didn't have the expertise myself, I had people around me I could call on to bring in. So it started then, and it was straight in, no induction, no training, straight in, 100%. That was amazing. Yeah, fabulous job.
Wow, that's incredible. And I think often when we talk about breaking a class ceiling, as significant as that, it's glamorized and it's admired, but it can also be really challenging. What were the difficulties that you faced during, like, once you became sergeant, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I had thought, okay, I might get some difficulties with the old Tory Guard, for example. But because I think now a lot of members come in from a business background, so there aren't so many career politicians anymore. And I think they saw this was a change. Let's give it a chance. Very, very different person, as I've described. But a lot of them knew me because of the work I'd already done in the House. And there were one or two who challenged me, and I would deal with it by saying, yes, I absolutely agree with you, recognizing that is a problem, and I'm working on it. One example, I'm not going to name who it was, but it was a very senior member of the Tory party. And it was when the Tamils were occupying Parliament Square. And it was horrendous time because they were using mobile phones to alert people to come. And they would get the mothers to bring the babies in pushchairs, and they would be the perimeter. So nobody was going to try and move them away. They had food wagons came and delivered food so that they could eat there. I mean, I don't know how they dealt with other things, and I really don't want to know about that. So that was very challenging. But I worked with the Deputy Mayor, Kit Walthouse, who's now an MP himself, and I worked with the Minister in charge at the time, who has sadly died, and I worked with the Met Police. And we got some legislation through to be able to clear Parliament Square. And from then on, you could only protest there if you had permission. And so that was a big achievement. And I met this person walking through the colonnade one day and said, "Oh, Mr. I hope you've seen that Parliament Square is empty now." And he had to say, yes, good job, Sergeant. That was sort of the internal challenge. But security was the biggest challenge because you never knew what was going to happen. So you could have the best plans in place, and there's a lot of technical security, particularly in Portcullis House, which I knew all about because I've been involved in it. There's a lot of technical security, there's a lot of plain clothes security, and then the uniformed and now, unfortunately, the armed security. But what they say is that you have to be fortunate every day. The terrorist only has to be lucky once. And that's the challenge. So security was probably the biggest always hanging over you issue. And, we could plan and put mitigations in place, but you never actually knew that you were 100% safe ever. So that was a huge responsibility.
And how did you overcome the anxiety faced with that anything could go wrong at any moment?
Because I knew we'd done the best we could. Well, I knew I had a great team working with me, and I knew we'd done all the contingency planning. We did a lot of contingency planning, a lot of exercises. You know, we knew if X happened, this is what the response would be. If Y happened, that would, you know, and you probably had A to Z of situations that we had plans for. I knew we'd been as exhaustive as we could possibly be. So I could just park that. I do have the ability to park things. You'd say I've done as much as I possibly can for that. I can't do any more. So I'm not going to waste time worrying about it. I'll park that and move on to something else. That's how I deal with anxiety. And sadly, I learned that at a time that my children were quite young, my parents were sick and I was working. And juggling those three, with each one of them, I thought, well, I've done everything I can for them. You know, the children at school, they're safe, they've got lunch, they know that I'm picking them up. I can park that and then sort of concentrate on one of the others, which is, it's very good because that does help you deal with anxiety and other bad things that can happen.
Do you have any other tools that you used when days were really difficult to motivate yourself and to keep yourself grounded and centered?
To think beyond, yeah, to look at the bigger picture. Because if you're in the middle of something and it's right here, it's very easy to drown in it. So to be able to flip into the bigger picture, or, you know, the bigger picture with family or something, just to be able to change your thoughts from there to something bigger and more positive.
100%. And speaking of the bigger picture, what would you say your 3 key takeaways from your entire amazing career have been? And what advice would you impart to your 2 children, to your daughters who are now working, who I'm sure have amazing established careers?
There are sort of the hackneyed things about always do your best, but I think the self-belief is a huge one. Absolutely self-belief. And I think if you can look in the mirror in the morning and say, yeah, what I'm doing here is right, then that's a really good start to the day. If you look in the mirror and saying, I'm not happy about this, then you should walk away from it. Because it's only yourself that you're accountable to. So that looking in the mirror is a big thing. And if you can say, yeah, this is good, this feels right, I'm congruent with this, then that's fine. But if you're not, then you've got to think seriously about walking away from it. That's one. Self-belief, that's another one. Yeah, and keep your options open always. Always have other things you're looking at. I don't particularly mean looking at other jobs, but, you know, just keeping your options open so that your well-being is important, your family is important, your friends are important, your networks are important. Just keep all those things all bubbling away. And that's how you become to be a sort of a fulfilled person.
Amazing. Now let's talk about the gender index. I'm so excited to speak about that because it's something that I've personally done a lot of research with for my studies, and that's how I found out about you and all of your amazing work. I think that it's so cool. So for our listeners who don't know what the gender index is, it is an online interactive tracking tool of over 4.4 million active UK companies and has freely available big picture and micro data into female-owned companies across the UK, aiming to provide a clear and accurate picture of the UK businesses and landscape in terms of gender and representation. Could you please explain the motivation behind this initiative and how it helps create a more equal future?
Yes, well, as I said, rewinding, that I am passionate about supporting women and small businesses. And in this whole female entrepreneurship ecosystem, until we had the gender index, there was no data about women-led companies. So there'd be small bits of research, you know, with maybe 5,000 respondents, fine. There'd be surveys, they were static in time though. And you couldn't really make comparisons between them. It was unrealistic. It was like comparing apples and bananas. So a group of us had been for about 10 years we knew the data existed, we just couldn't get it unlocked. And we worked with government, HMRC, academics, you name it, we worked with them to try and move towards this. And we were making progress at snail's pace. until through the all-party group on women in enterprise, which I'm a business member of, I was introduced to a man called John Cushing, who's the CEO and founder of the MNAI data platform. And that platform can produce gender segregated data. And the reason it does that is that John was asked to mentor a company, 2 female founders. They're a very successful online interior design company. And they were doing very well, and they wanted to grow to the next stage, which meant they had to secure funding. And they weren't having very much success. So John was asked to mentor them, and he did. And they told him about the really bad experiences they'd had about not even being considered for funding, about being turned down at the first stage, but almost being laughed out the room when faced with a panel of all male venture capitalists. So they had a really bad time. And he spent several hours with them trying to unpick this, and he was able to help them to move on. But he went back to his team and said, how many more companies are there like this led by women who are having difficulty getting funding? And even the question, how many are there, nobody could answer him, and nobody could find out. So they had got this massive data platform on all UK SMEs. And so he set them the brief to build the algorithms and the machine learning to be able to gender disaggregate that data. And there's sort of quite a philanthropic stream in the company. And he felt that he'd got this really rich pot of data, but didn't know how to share it. And there was I, with all these female-led companies trying to help them, trying to help people with startups. So I describe it that when data man met gender woman and our worlds collided, that's when the gender index was born. And so that was in June 2020, and we worked very well together. He's probably younger than my children. And by the December, we had got this plan together to launch the gender index as an interactive website. And the red line was it had to be free to access, because we weren't going to get people to use the data. We weren't going to drive the growth of female entrepreneurship and ultimately have a fairer future, which is the very long-term ambition. And so we needed to secure funding. And we were able to, it was, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it wasn't incredibly difficult, because we were able to talk to organisations who shared our ambition and who were already doing a lot to support female entrepreneurs. And so for them, this was eureka as well, because they could then see how people were doing, in which sectors, what kind of investment was being picked up, what kind of investment wasn't, which is VC funding, as you would have gathered from what I said earlier. And so we got together a group of 6 partners and sponsors, and they funded us for the build of the website and all the associated design and the marketing. And we launched at the end of March last year, 2022. And it, the other part of it was that we had to prove the integrity of the data. And so through connections that I already had with the Enterprise Research Centre, Aston and Warwick Business School, we were able through them to identify a leading business school in each of the 4 nations. And so we work with Warwick Business School and ERC for England, Strathclyde for Scotland, Cardiff for Wales, and Queen's Belfast in Northern Ireland. And we gave them a year's worth of data and asked them to break it, and they couldn't. So that was how we secured the integrity. And they then did academic research on the data, and that their findings and insights formed the basis of our first report. So again, on the 31st of March last year, we published gender disaggregated data for the first time, which was a huge celebration. We launched our website and we launched our first printed report. So it was a big day. So the report has contributions from the 4 nations and a UK narrative, contributions from our partner sponsors about why they think this is so important. And then it was about encouraging people to use the data, which you, Mahika, have done yourself. And it's now about raising awareness, getting people to understand what it can do, getting investors to use it so they can see where the women-led companies are, in what sectors, if they're fast growth or not. So there's now, I think there's 8 filters. There's gender, area, so whole of the UK, the regions, right down to local authority level. by sector, by investment type, by fast growth, by age of company. And this year we've introduced 2 more filters, which is ethnic minority leadership and generational leadership. So it now has even greater breadth. And our second report that we published on the 5th of May has greater depth as well, because we can make comparisons between the 2 years. So you've got the reports, which give an overview of a year of data. So that's averages across the 2 years. And then you have the interactive website, which will tell you what the position is today in your area, in your sector.
I think all of that, it sounds phenomenal. And as someone who has interacted with the data firsthand, it's so easy to use. It's so interesting. And I urge every single one of the listeners to go have a look at it. Linking back to what you said, I think it's so crucial that you're now adding in intersectionality into the data as well, because that is a huge part of the inequalities. And you also talk about how the index is not a one-off study, but it's an ongoing survey. You recently released the newest report for 2023. What are your hopes for the 2024 edition? And not just from the gender index itself, but from the trends and patterns that we see?
Well, more growth. I mean, there are signs of growth. Last year, over 150,000 female-led companies were incorporated, and that's 21% of all the newly incorporated companies, which is up from 20% the previous year and is up on the 2 previous years. So there's really a growth trajectory there. That's one element. The numbers, the percentage went up from 16.8% last year. And these numbers are stark. I mean, they're not great, but at least we know where we are and we know what's moving. So last year, 16.8% of all the active companies in the UK were led by women. This year, that's gone up to 17.3%, which is 0.5%. And it doesn't sound very much, but when you consider that's 0.5% of over 750 million companies, that is a significant number. So that there's a rising trend there. And the other sort of heartwarming and really encouraging thing is Generation Z. Because Generation Z, of which you're one, are closing the gender gap. So their figures are higher than the national average. I think it was 21.9%. And they're also attracting more external funding than any other generation. And I think that's probably because they go for it. I don't think it's that funders are more generous to Generation Z. I think it's that they go for it, they make a good case, and they secure the funding. So those are just 3 really good national signs that things are improving.
That's amazing to know. And my last question for you is, looking at all the data and through all the work that you've done, what angers you the most about the situation with gender and intersectional inequality in the UK, and what gives you most hope?
Angers me most, I think the dismissal. I think the dismissal factor and the non-belief that people of whatever background can't do something, whereas actually we should all be taking the other view and believing that everybody can do something with the right help and support in place. So that's what makes me angriest. The thing I want to change most, that I think will have the greatest long-term impact, is that I want to get enterprise into the curriculum through primary through to higher education. We're taking the gender index around the UK on a series of roadshows, and we went to Wales earlier this month. And the results in Wales, in some areas, they outperform the other nations. And I believe that one reason for that is that they do have enterprise in the curriculum all the way through from primary. And it's not because you want everyone to run their own business, but it's because enterprise is a mindset. It's about thinking outside the box, problem solving, collaborating, being able to think macro and micro, which is good for anybody, whatever business they're going to be in, it's good for that business. So yeah, that's one of my biggest things that I want to do, is to get enterprise into the curriculum. And I think we'll see the results of that coming through.
Amazing. Well, thank you so incredibly much for all of your amazing insight today and for coming and speaking with me. I'm sure our listeners are going to benefit from all of your words of wisdom and your experience. How can people get involved with the Gender Index, and where can people find you?
Well, it's a great privilege to have had this opportunity to speak. I've really enjoyed it. It's the genderindex.co.uk, which is very straightforward, and on LinkedIn. If you have a look on LinkedIn, you can find me there.
Amazing. I will tag everything in the show notes, so our listeners have access to that as well. But thank you for speaking with me again. It was a pleasure. I had an amazing time. You were truly an empowering woman. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Empower Sounds podcast. Stay tuned every Monday for your weekly dose of inspiration and entertainment.